Hey folks, happy Friday to you. We continue our reading of the book of Colossians in preparation for Sunday's sermon on that book. Today, chapter 3, verses 5 through verse 25, which is the remainder of chapter 3. So start at chapter 3, verse 5, read the rest of that chapter. If you haven't done so, go press pause, go read that right now, then come back. Chapter 3 is really this beautiful description of the hope for the Christian life. So it begins with saying, don't be like this. And it's talking about the kind of people that had been grown in the Roman Empire. So they're combative with one another. There's a lot of worship of like local idols. There's arguing about that worship and very kind of free living, that everything goes, and really in a way they are using and abusing one another. It says, stop all of that. Begin living according to God's vision for your life with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other just as the Lord has forgiven you. So it's just this wonderful description of the Christian life. And one of those passages, sort of like the fruits of the Spirit, it's one of those passages that we get a very clear list of what it means to be Christ-like. Compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, patience. I do want to say something about the end of the passage, though, because then it begins to talk about slavery. Verse 22, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, not only while being watched in order to please them, but wholeheartedly fearing the Lord. And it goes on. Now, let me just say something about proof texting and how we need to understand passages like this. This passage for years has been used, was used, and is still used to justify American slavery, the enslavement of African peoples, and to condone, say that God condoned that kind of behavior. And that is flat out proof texting. That is people who have an argument about what they think should happen in the world, and they find a verse that supports them. So rather than us doing that, I mean, that's in essence bending God's will to ours, bending God's word to what we want. Instead, what we should do is we should encounter the biblical text, say, what is God's will? What is God's word? Then let's bend our lives towards that. So in order to understand this passage, you have to understand what slavery meant in that day. Slavery in that day, so people were caught in war, and you might become a slave in that way. Your people were overtaken in war. Also, there was a very strict caste system. So your family might be workers for the rich people, and your children were born into that same lifestyle. And there was no opportunity for them to get out of that lifestyle. You were owned by that other family. That's who you worked for, who owned you, who provided for you, and you were their worker. That's what they would have called a slave. And I'm not saying that that's right, but that in some ways what they're talking about here is very different than going to Africa and stealing people and then torturing them in work. So it's a very different connotation, very different definition of slavery. And if we're going to truly be students of the biblical text, we have to go back and ask of the text, what did it mean in that original sense? And then, however we're defining it today, would that be in step with the definitions of compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, a loving God? At the very end of the day, what we have to do is we have to say, okay, if our God is all love and all grace, then our behavior should be all love and all grace. No matter if we're using the biblical text or not, does our behavior communicate all love and all grace? Clearly, American slavery did not. And so then it is not of God and the biblical text then cannot be used to justify. You see how that works? And so the question is, What behavior for you today communicates all love and all grace? How can you find compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience growing out of your life? That's what Paul was after. That's what the Colossians were after. That's what we're after. God bless.